The steam room was nestled just outside the sleepy market town of Ashford, tucked behind a freshly built pine fence. It wasn't a modern spa, nor was it some crumbling relic from decades past. It was a neat timber lodge, its sauna heated by wood, with a warm lounge room complete with a crackling fireplace, and a large copper tub filled with herbal infusions where one could soak beneath the stars. James and Emily were driving there with a particular kind of anticipation. It had been a hellish week, and frankly James just wanted to lie down on the wooden bench, sweat out the stress, and forget the world, forget work, bills, and the endless to-do lists. We'll deal with it later, he had told himself. They were meeting their friends, Daniel and Victoria, their old friends who had become like family over the years. They'd spent holidays together, day trips, even a memorable vacation to Cornwall as a group of 4. It was easy, relaxed, without any fuss. But, of course, that was the danger. When things got too easy, people let their guard down. And a relaxed person isn't always a sensible one. Daniel arrived in his usual style. A graphic t-shirt proclaiming himself king of casual, flip-flops with socks, a fashion crime punishable by eye roll, and a bottle of cider in his hand. Victoria was right beside him, slender and tall, wrapped in a short, puffy jacket that barely concealed the confidence radiating from the fact she was wearing just a swimsuit underneath. She liked to be noticed. Compared to her, Emily seemed quieter, more modest. But James had learned over time that behind Emily's gentle smiles was a depth not obvious at first glance. "All right, lads, ready to steam up?" Daniel called out, the moment they hadn't even closed the boot of the car yet. "Ready," replied James. They unpacked quickly. The women headed off to the changing room. James and Daniel stoked the fire, threw in a mix of herbs, chamomile, mint, thyme, just as tradition dictated. Then they raised their first glasses, to friendship, to health, to the sauna itself. "You been eyeing Victoria?" Daniel asked, not looking at James but with a knowing smirk, just as Emily came out wrapped in a towel. "What do you mean?" James grunted, trying to sound innocent. Daniel chuckled, "Just saying, I can tell you're a lively bloke. And she loves it when you look, even when you shouldn't." James said nothing. The truth was, he had glanced at Victoria, but no more than a friend's husband ought to. Soon the women returned, barefoot and wrapped in robes. Emily's damp hair clung to her flushed cheeks, while Victoria's robe resisted every attempt to stay closed, as if inviting the world to see more. "Ready for the steam, girls?" Daniel shouted. "Ready as ever," Victoria replied, turning at the doorway with a sly smile at James. "Don't even think about peeking." He smiled back, though inside something stirred, as if the sauna air thickened, or perhaps it was just the beginning of something more. The first rounds in the steam room were always quiet. No one was warmed up yet, not truly. They sat at the edges. Daniel on the lower bench, James above him, the women between them. Hot, sticky, clammy. Bodies glisten with sweat. Daniel was generous with the steam, almost as if exacting revenge on the stove. The mist was so thick fingers disappeared. Emily sat close to James, her thigh pressed against his. He felt the shiver under her skin, the trail of sweat sliding down her back. Across from him, Victoria sat upright, half closing her eyes either from the heat or because she was enjoying the attention. James didn't know where to look, yet he knew exactly where to. "I'll give you the treatment you like," Daniel said, standing up, grabbing the birch whisk and flipping Emily over onto her stomach on the top bench. Emily giggled softly but didn't resist. James stayed silent. After all, in a sauna, privacy was a flexible concept, especially among friends. "You comfy, love?" Daniel asked, his hand lingering on her thigh a moment too long. James glanced at Victoria. She was already looking at him, unblinking. Inside, something shifted. It was like the ground beneath their feet had been rocked, yet they pretended it was just a passing train. During a break, they went outside to cool off. The copper tub was ready, steaming gently. James and Daniel sat on either side. The women eased between them. The street lamps cast a soft glow on their shoulders, necks, and collarbones. Everything sparkled like a scene from a film. "Let's play a game," Victoria proposed, "a sauna rule. Everyone says something they want to try but are too scared to admit." James glanced at Emily. She looked surprised but not frightened. "You start," Daniel said. "You've got to kick things off." "All right," she said quietly. Victoria licked her lips. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to switch places. The body, the desires, even the man. Just to try it out." Silence fell. Even the drops from the trees seemed to pause. James felt Emily tense beside him briefly before relaxing or pretending to. Maybe she was curious, seriously curious. "Well, I'll go," James said, laughing to break the suspense like a sitcom husband. "What harm if it's all consensual? No hard feelings. Just an experiment, that's just a setup," Daniel scoffed. "You know she loves to tease like that." "Maybe," Emily whispered. "Maybe it's not such a setup after all." Their eyes met, electric shocks shooting between all four of them. James suddenly realized the game had begun, and everyone had already stepped forward. Now it was only a question of who would cross the line first. They returned to the sauna in silence. No jokes, no laughter, just a light, almost intimate tension hanging between them. The heat, the steam, the birch whisk were all the same, yet everything felt different now. Victoria suddenly declared, "This time the men steam the women." "We'll relax," she lay down first, looking at James with a challenge. No hint of shyness, James took the whisk, knowing by then there was no turning back. About 10 minutes into the next round, James stepped out to cool off. The heat wasn't just from the steam. It was the looks, the unsaid words, the way Emily let Daniel soap her shoulders. Sure, it was meant to be a joke, a sauna thing, but James knew his wife too well. He saw how she almost deliberately didn't hold back a laugh, how she leaned in closer than necessary outside. The steam rose from their bodies. A light breeze cut the skin. James wrapped a towel around himself and sat on a bench, breathing deeply. His head buzzed, not from the cider but from an internal overheating. It was like something had been triggered that couldn't be switched off. The door creaked quietly open, and Victoria stepped into the dimness. Damp hair, eyes glowing like lamps in the half-light. "Cold?" she asked. "Not cold. Overheated, more like." She sat close, shoulder to shoulder. "Didn't expect you to be so shy. And you too bold." She smiled, gazing long into the darkness before saying softly, "I once dreamed of a different life. Not this one with suburban houses, roast dinners and husband and wife sauna trips. Something real. On the edge. Where you don't ask permission to want. And now maybe it's too late. Or maybe just the right time." They fell silent. She lowered her gaze. James noticed the drop of sweat slowly tracing her collarbone, disappearing beneath the towel. "We're all playing, aren't we?" he whispered. "Flirting, jokes, touches. Pretending nothing's going on." "Yes. But sometimes someone decides enough with the game." She turned slowly to face him. Her expression was serious. No coquettishness, just a woman choosing. "Tell me," she whispered, "if it happened, would you regret it?" James didn't know what to say. Neither of them wanted to hear the answer. She leaned in, forehead to his, cheek to cheek. They didn't kiss, just breathed each other, and we don't even have to do it. Just imagining it is enough. He closed his eyes. In that quiet he understood. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. Even if nothing physical happened, everything else already had. Victoria stood up first. As she left, she whispered, "Look at Emily. She's already made her choice. Now we just have to keep up." James stayed on the bench alone, his mind roaring like the fire inside the sauna, while his chest felt empty, the silence where everything he'd built over years was crumbling. Back in the changing room, the air felt different, heavier, wetter, as if it carried the weight hanging between them all. Emily and Daniel were sitting close, barefoot in towels, laughing about something. Emily's gaze held a look James hadn't seen in a long time. Not flirtatious but openly playful, as if she had suddenly decided, enough with being the perfect wife. Victoria entered silently behind him, didn't sit, but slowly slipped off her towel and hung it on a hook. Without a word. Standing bare. As if it didn't matter who was watching. No one spoke. At that moment they all understood. James glanced from Victoria to Emily to Daniel, and realized no one was pretending. It was all real. Daniel stood grinning and said, "All right, gentlemen, how about a proper round without towels? If you're steaming, you're honest. If you hide, you're not with us." They all began to undress in silence. No shame, only anticipation. Sharp, piercing looks no longer avoiding the bodies of others. James watched Emily. She removed her towel slowly, not like she did it at home but as if on stage. Not for him but for Daniel. He should have felt jealousy, but instead there was something else, a strange arousal, as if he had stepped into a world where anything was allowed if you decided it was. Inside the sauna they sat closer, knees almost touching. Everything was wet. glistening in the dim light. No one pretended any. The morning light filtered softly through the thin curtains of the lodge, painting the room in muted golds and grays. Outside, the world was waking up slowly, birds chirping, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. But inside the small lounge, the air felt thick, as though the night's secrets were still hanging between the wooden beams. James sat quietly by the window, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass, watching the dew glisten on the grass outside. His mind replayed fragments of the previous evening, the whispered confessions, the stolen glances, the electric touches that had both shattered and somehow rebuilt something inside him. Emily emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in a soft, oversized knit cardigan, one he didn't recognize, perhaps Victoria's, and a pair of delicate silk shorts that whispered against her skin as she moved. Her hair was still damp, strands curling loosely around her face, framing eyes that held a new kind of intensity. The soft light caught the subtle curve of her neck and the gentle swell of her collarbone, hinting at the vulnerability beneath her composed expression. "Coffee's ready," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying weight nonetheless. James turned, managing a small, uneven smile. "Thanks." They moved to the little kitchen nook, a space no bigger than a cupboard, where a kettle steamed beside a battered tin of Earl Grey. Emily poured 2 cups, the ceramic mugs clinking softly in the quiet room. She handed one to James, their fingers brushing briefly, a touch both tender and loaded with unspoken meaning. "I don't think I slept much," she admitted, her eyes downcast. "Neither did I," James replied, swirling the hot liquid thoughtfully. There was a pause, the kind that stretches long and awkward before two people who once shared everything now hesitate over the simplest words. "Last night," Emily began, then stopped herself, biting her lip. "It was..." She searched for the right phrase. "Unexpected." "Yeah," James agreed. "More than that." She looked up then, meeting his gaze fully. "Do you regret it?" James hesitated. "I don't know how to answer that." Emily's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through the tension. "Neither do I. But I think, maybe regret isn't the right word. It was more like waking up. Like suddenly realizing you've been asleep at the wheel all this time." James nodded slowly. "I felt the same." Outside, the sound of footsteps approached. Daniel entered the room, his hair tousled and eyes bloodshot, but with that same mischievous grin that had become his trademark. "Morning, sleepyheads," he said, raising his mug. "Well, that was one hell of a night. I swear my socks still smell like eucalyptus." Victoria followed behind, wrapped in a soft cream-colored robe that fell just short of revealing the elegant curve of her thighs. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, stray wisps framing a face that seemed calm, yet guarded. "Good morning," she said softly, settling beside Daniel. James caught Emily's glance. There was a flicker of something, relief? Understanding. And then it was gone. "Oh," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "What now? Pretend it didn't happen? Go back to our boring lives like nothing changed?" Victoria's eyes sparkled with an edge of defiance. "I don't think any of us can do that." "No," James agreed. "Not really." Emily reached out, placing her hand on his. "Maybe it's not about forgetting. Maybe it's about accepting." Daniel laughed, a low warm sound. "Accepting that we're all a bit more complicated than we thought." "That too," Emily smiled. They sat there, for friends tangled in a web of choices and consequences, the morning sun creeping higher and casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. James caught Victoria's eye and saw in her a reflection of his own conflicted thoughts. A woman who had always danced on the edge, now caught in the gravity of something real. "Do you think it's possible," he wondered aloud, "to come back from this? To keep what we had but still move forward?" Victoria's smile was enigmatic. "I think it's possible. But it won't be easy." Emily squeezed James's hand. "Nothing worthwhile ever is outside." A blackbird sang boldly, unperturbed by the fragile peace inside the lodge. The day was beginning, but the night's heat still lingered. A reminder that sometimes, the hottest fires burn quietly beneath the surface. As they finished their coffee, a sudden chill swept through the room. James glanced toward the doorway, expecting to see a breeze or perhaps a shadow. Instead, his eyes caught something else, a folded envelope, resting on the windowsill where no one had placed it before. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper in his hands. The seal was unmarked, no signature. Emily leaned over his shoulder, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" James carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant but urgent. Some truths are easier to face in the dark. Meet me at the crossroads at midnight. Alone. A silence fell over the room, heavier than before. Who could have sent this? Emily whispered. "I no idea," James replied. His heart quickening. Daniel frowned. "Sounds like the start of a bad thriller." Victoria smirked. "Or the next chapter in our story." James folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. "Midnight at the crossroads," he repeated. "Looks like the night isn't over yet." Outside, the wind picked up, swirling leaves across the yard as if nature itself was stirring something ominous. The lodge, once a sanctuary, felt suddenly like the calm before a storm, and none of them could shake the feeling that the real game was just beginning. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting Ashford in a soft twilight glow as James stood by the weathered crossroads just outside town. The narrow country lanes intersected here beneath a crooked old oak, its branches twisting like gnarled fingers against the deepening sky. The air smelled of damp earth and fading summer, with a hint of wood smoke lingering from the distant chimneys. James checked his watch. 11:58. Perfect timing. He tugged his jacket tighter around him, the chills seeping through the fabric despite the layers beneath. The letter in his pocket felt heavier now, a tangible weight pressing against his ribs. He wasn't sure if it was the cold, or the anticipation, or the knot of nerves that tightened every time he thought about last night, or about what might come next. Behind him, the faint crunch of footsteps approached through the gravel. James turned quickly, heart pounding. Victoria emerged from the shadow of the lane, her silhouette outlined by the flickering light of a lone street lamp. She was dressed in a simple black coat, cinched at the waist, and a pair of sleek ankle boots that clicked softly against the stones. Her hair was loose, wild in the breeze, and her eyes sparkled with a mixture of curiosity and something darker. "Resolve, maybe right on time," she said with a wry smile, hands tucked into her pockets. James nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Didn't think you'd come." "Neither did I, until I read the letter." She hesitated, then added, "It's not just a game anymore, is it?" "No," James agreed. "Feels like the stakes just got higher." They stood in silence for a moment, the night wrapping around them like a thick velvet cloak. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the wind carried the faint melody of church bells striking midnight. "Who do you think sent it?" Victoria asked, voice barely above a whisper. James shrugged. "No idea. But whoever it is knows more than they're letting on." Victoria shifted her weight, her coat falling open slightly to reveal a flash of a delicate silver necklace resting just above the collar of her blouse. James's eyes flicked to it, then quickly away. The moment was charged, electric, and yet tinged with an unspoken tension. "Funny," Victoria said, breaking the silence, "how a simple invitation can turn your whole world upside down." James smiled faintly. "I suppose that's the thing about crossroads. They're not just about directions. Sometimes they're about choices." Before Victoria could respond, a shadow detached itself from the darkness deeper down the lane. Daniel emerged, his usual grin replaced by a guarded expression. He wore a leather jacket thrown over a plain shirt, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. "Hope I'm not crashing the party," he said, voice low. James shook his head. "No, you're right on time." Victoria arched an eyebrow. "So we're all in on this mystery meeting?" Daniel shrugged. "Seems like it. I got the same letter slipped under my door. Midnight crossroads, alone. But here we are." James glanced back toward the village lights flickering in the distance. "We're anything but alone now." The three of them stood there, a triangle of uneasy alliance beneath the ancient oak. The wind stirred the leaves, sending a cascade of rustling whispers through the branches. "Should we wait?" Daniel asked. "For what?" Victoria countered. "If whoever sent this wants to talk, they'll come. If not, well, then we've got ourselves a nice midnight stroll." James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, eyes narrowing at the screen. "No caller ID." He hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A voice, distorted and unfamiliar, whispered back, "Not long now. Trust no one. The truth is closer than you think." The line went dead. Victoria's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. Daniel let out a low whistle. "Well, that's ominous." James folded his arms, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down. "Looks like whatever this is, it's bigger than us." Suddenly, from the shadows beyond the oak, a figure stepped forward. A tall man in a dark coat, face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His presence was commanding, unsettling. "That I'm glad you came," the stranger said, voice smooth but edged with steel. "There's much to discuss, and little time." Victoria exchanged a glance with James and Daniel. The game, it seemed, was no longer just about temptation and desire. It had become something far more dangerous. The man extended a gloved hand. "Shall we?" As they followed him down the lane toward the unknown, James couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything, and that once crossed, there was no turning back. The narrow country lane seemed to close in around them as James, Victoria, and Daniel followed the mysterious man deeper into the shadows. The moon hung low and heavy, casting a pale, ghostly light that flickered through the swaying branches overhead. The air had grown colder, sharper, filled with the scent of damp leaves and something faintly metallic, like the promise of secrets long buried. James's heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm echoing in his ears louder than the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. Behind him, Victoria's heels clicked softly but steadily, her composure undiminished despite the tension thickening between them. Daniel, ever the joker, had gone quiet, his usual bravado replaced by a watchful alertness. "Where exactly are we going?" James finally asked, voice barely more than a breath. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stopped at a rusted iron gate, its paint peeling, the hinges groaning as he pushed it open. Beyond lay a narrow path winding into a dense thicket, swallowed by shadows. "Patience," the man said, turning to face them. His hat tilted just enough to reveal the sharp line of his jaw, and a pair of piercing gray eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness. "All will be revealed in due time." Victoria exchanged a look with James, half challenge, half invitation. Daniel ran a hand through his messy hair, his mouth twitching into a lopsided grin that didn't reach his eyes. They stepped through the gate, the world beyond suddenly feeling smaller, constricted not just by the trees but by the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. The path twisted and turned, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound besides their breathing, each breath a foggy plume in the chilly night air. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened into a small clearing. At its center stood an old, abandoned chapel, its stone walls cracked and overgrown with ivy. The stained glass windows were shattered, the wooden door hanging ajar as if inviting them in, or warning them away. James swallowed hard. The place looked like something out of a Gothic novel, a setting for secrets and sins. "This is where it begins," the stranger said, gesturing toward the chapel. "Inside you will find what you seek, or what you fear." Victoria stepped forward, her voice steady. "And if we refuse?" The man smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "Refusal is a luxury none of you can afford." James glanced at Daniel, who shrugged. "Well, when life hands you midnight mysteries, you might as well play along." They crossed the threshold together, the creaking door closing behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down James's spine. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of old incense. Moonlight filtered through the jagged glass, casting fractured rainbows across the cracked stone floor. Shadows danced on the walls as they moved deeper into the chapel's nave. To the far end, a small wooden table was set beneath the altar, illuminated by the soft glow of a single candle. On it lay a leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked, the title faded beyond recognition. The stranger approached the table, his gloved fingers tracing the spine. "This book contains the truth you've been avoiding. It will show you what lies beneath the surface of your comfortable lives." James felt a surge of unease. "Why us? Why now?" "Because your choices have consequences," the man replied. "Because the line you cross was not just personal, it was the beginning of something far greater." Victoria stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" The stranger's gaze flicked to each of them in turn. "You think the night was about desire. It was about awakening. About realizing that the lives you lead are built on illusions." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Great. So, we're in some kind of cult initiation." The man's expression darkened. "Call it what you will. But the question remains. Are you ready to face the truth?" James reached out, his fingers brushing the cover of the book. The leather was surprisingly warm beneath his touch, as if it held a heartbeat of its own. With a deep breath, he opened it. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols, faded photographs, and handwritten notes, fragments of lives intertwined in ways none of them could have imagined. As they leaned in to study the contents, a sudden noise echoed from the chapel's entrance. A sharp metallic clang. They turned to see the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place with an ominous finality. The Stranger's eyes gleamed. No turning back now. James's pulse quickened. The air felt charged, electric. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying a whisper that seemed to echo in his mind. Some truths demand a price, and in that moment James understood. Their journey had only just begun. The sudden slam of the chapel door echoed like a gunshot through the hollow space, bouncing off cracked stone and shattered glass. James's breath caught in his throat as the heavy lock clicked into place with a finality that left no room for retreat. The dim candlelight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like specters along the walls. Victoria immediately moved toward the door, testing it with a firm push. "Lock tight," she muttered, her voice steady but edged with tension. "We're trapped?" Daniel let out a low whistle, the usual bravado replaced by something more cautious. "Well, this just went from bad idea to worse. Anyone have a plan?" The stranger stepped back from the altar, hands folded neatly in front of him. "Plans are for those who don't understand the gravity of the situation. You're here to learn, not escape." James's eyes narrowed. "Learn what? Why us? What's all this about?" The man's gaze sharpened, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "Because your lives are tangled in a web far more complex than you realize. The choices you made last night, they were only the surface." Victoria stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You mean the sauna? The night we shared? You think it's connected to whatever this is?" "More than connected," the stranger replied. "It was a catalyst. A spark that ignited something that has been waiting to be uncovered." James swallowed hard, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down. The warmth of last night's touches, the tangled emotions, suddenly felt like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to see. Daniel glanced at the leather-bound book on the altar, then back at the stranger. "So what? We're some kind of pawns in a bigger game." "In a way, yes," the man said softly. "But you also have a choice. To face the truth or to remain blind." The candle flickered violently, casting the room into momentary darkness before reigniting with a stubborn glow. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Show us," he said finally, voice steady despite the storm swirling inside. The stranger nodded and gestured toward the book. "The truth is written here, but it requires more than just reading. It demands understanding and acceptance." Victoria crouched beside the altar, flipping open the worn pages. The cryptic symbols and faded photographs seemed almost alive under the candlelight. James leaned in, his fingers tracing the faded ink. Suddenly, a folded photograph slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the floor. James picked it up, heart skipping a beat. The photo was old, sepia-toned and slightly curled, but unmistakable. It showed the four of them: James, Emily, Daniel, and Victoria. They were younger, smiling at a summer festival years ago, unaware of the tangled paths that would bring them here. "Why do we have this?" Victoria whispered, eyes wide. The stranger's voice was calm but firm. "Because your histories are intertwined." The night in the sauna was not a coincidence. It was a convergence. Daniel frowned. "Convergence of what? Some secret society?" "No," the man corrected. "A convergence of choices, desires, and consequences. Every action ripples outward, affecting those around you in ways unseen." James looked at his friends, the faces in the photo, and then back at the stranger. "And what happens if we refuse to accept this truth?" The man's eyes darkened. "Refusal is itself a choice. One that carries its own price." A sudden gust of wind swept through the broken windows, extinguishing the candle, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting eerie patterns through the shards of stained glass. James's heart pounded as he heard a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "The game has only just begun." In the silence that followed, the four of them exchanged glances, each realizing that the night's revelations were far from over, and the path ahead was shadowed with uncertainty. Outside, the ancient oak stood sentinel against the night, its branches creaking like a warning, and somewhere, in the distance, a clock struck one.